Many people believe that it's best to start by implementing an advisory board, since it's a softer type of board for an owner particularly.
If we're talking about an advisory board, a classic advisory board, what can be done to make it more effective?
It makes sense to have a list of the powers of the supervisory board, the advisory board, and to actually assemble the set of authorities of your board. That's why, Dmytro, we came up with the name Transitional Board. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors channel with Sergiy Bulavin. Today, together with Dmytro Kozlov, whom you already know, we will discuss different options, different types of boards, including supervisory boards and advisory boards, and talk about in which situations they work better and in which they work worse. And what should we do about it?
Hello, Sergey.
Dmytro, we know that advisory boards are considered a pretty decent tool for companies to start their movement towards the direction of introduction of boards in general. And many people believe that you should first implement an advisory board, because it's a softer type of board for an owner who doesn't yet have trust or an understanding of how it works. And only after that, gradually move towards a supervisory board. On the other hand, there are companies that have both an advisory board and a supervisory board. There are companies that have only an advisory board, and these companies do not plan to transform this board into a supervisory one in the future. Let's talk about this now and exchange our thoughts. Well, starting with the basics, what is the difference between an advisory board and a supervisory board?
I think our viewers may already know this, but, well, an advisory board is a board that, without any additional powers, gives advice that is not mandatory to follow. And this is what fundamentally distinguishes it from a supervisory board or any other boards. A supervisory board is a formally established governing body that is specified in the charter, for example, to oversee the company, yes, on behalf of the owners and stakeholders.
And if we talk about formalization, in principle, there are companies that have regulations regarding the board, the advisory board, which outline not the powers, since the power is to advise, but rather the structure of how this board operates. For example, who can submit questions to the advisory board? In what format are the meetings held?
The hours?
The hours, and so on. For example, you and I have participated in different advisory boards, and each advisory board has its own particular features. For instance, in some companies, the advisory board can both initiate questions itself and receive questions from the owners and from top management. In another company, it might work only as, for example, questions initiated solely by the owner and no one else.
And let's put it this way, based on our experience, if we're talking about an advisory board, and we should clarify, we're talking about private business, let's make that clear. Because if we're talking about state-owned companies, financial holdings, and so on, those are regulated by legislation. We're talking about private business. And if we're talking about private business, then in most cases, the advisory board will communicate with the owner, the CEO, and the top management.
Yes.
That's just the way it is. A classic advisory board, or an advisory board with some additional powers, which is what we'll be discussing further.
And to put it very simply, the difference between an advisory board and a supervisory board is that the advisory board doesn't make decisions. It gives its advice, and the decisions based on that advice are made either by the CEO or the owner, depending on level of this question. Additionally, the advisory board can operate without a formal regulation, or it can work with one. But this is not a statutory document.
No.
It is an internal company-wide regulation that applies to all employees.
Or simply a not formalized agreement?
Or an agreement.
Yes.
The supervisory board operates in such a way that it makes decisions that are mandatory for the company to execute. Moreover, there is a rather strict structure for how this works. This means protocols, voting, and it's very important to record who voted for and who voted against each issue, so that later, when questions of responsibility arise, it is possible to understand who supported a bad or good decision and who did not. Also, the powers of the supervisory board are specified in the charter documents. That's if we talk about the difference between advisory and supervisory boards. A big question is whether an advisory board, in its pure form and without additional powers, can be effective for business.
I think that as a tool, at the beginning it can be effective, and then everything will depend on the quality and the members of the board, on how much trust will grow between them and the owner, because that will be important, and also on their effectiveness, the effectiveness of the advice they give. And this will influence changes, potential changes in the duties or powers of the advisory board. What do you think?
A lot depends on the level at which the company is at. If the company is systematized, if all decisions are made and executed, then of course an advisory board in its pure form, that is, a board that gives advice, can probably function. It can provide additional opinions, additional perspectives, additional opportunities, and bring its expertise and experience in order to expand the opportunities seen by top management or the owner. In cases where the company is less systematized, and by the way, this is unfortunately a common phenomenon in Ukrainian companies, in the SMB sector, small and medium-sized businesses, or even in somewhat larger companies, the fact that an advisory board will provide with the advice doesn't automatically mean that the owner or management will use it for the benefit of the company.
I agree on that. I think that theoretically there may be companies where everything works in a systematized way and this vertical is functioning, the executive one I mean, and then indeed the advisory board will work. It will be effective. But the question is, how many such companies are there in Ukraine?
Yes, unfortunately the percentage will be very small. And as a rule, such companies are quite systematized. And as a rule, such companies have supervisory boards.
Well, yes, they've already grown out of being a startup company development. They've gone through all that, and then they become larger, more established, more systematized. And then indeed, the next question will be whether it's a supervisory board or an advisory board with some additional powers.
Yes, well, now we can move on to supervisory boards. Why are they created to a lesser extent in Ukrainian business?
Listen, I don't know. I think that, well, first of all, it's about risks. Because, as we said, the creation of a supervisory board at the very least means formalizing this board, and it needs to be specified in the charter. And then this board, or rather the board members, they make decisions that are mandatory to execute. It's not just the owner alone or the owners, but rather the board, which can, of course, include the owner or owners. So these are certain risks for the owner. And as long as you said, as long as there isn't that level of trust in the board and board members, I think the owner will resist such a decision.
So if we consolidate all the factors that prevent us from immediately creating a supervisory board, let's try to do that now. First of all, it's trust. That is, the owner doesn't trust in board as the tool, first and foremost. Secondly, at the crucial stage of creating the board and carefully selecting its members, he unfortunately doesn't fully trust the chosen board members. Trust is very, very important indeed.
But listen, let me add one more thing. What do you think? Could there be another criterion like, say, the company's appetite towards growth? Because we understand that a supervisory board is more about control, right? Control over the implementation of strategy, achieving strategic goals. An advisory board or an advisory board with additional powers is more about development. Could it also depend, if we're talking about a company that's still developing, scaling up, could that also be a factor, right? What do you think?
I absolutely agree. Moreover, if we talk about control, let's imagine that the owner is also the CEO and he is the sole owner. In this case, standard corporate governance simply wouldn't make sense. Not only would it be pointless, but the owner wouldn't even have a need for it. He already handles all current matters and controls everything himself. An additional body that would oversee the owner himself would look a bit odd.
The owner's other role.
Yes, so in such a situation, control issues probably take a back seat. Moreover, if you suggest to the owner to create a supervisory board just so that the board can oversight, it won't match his needs. In other words, he simply doesn't need it. That's probably why advisory boards are actually more popular among owners.
I agree. By the way, there's one more thing, we understand that creating a supervisory board is a more complicated process because you need to have regulations for the board, its powers, and so on. This is a document that describes how everything is done. As you also mentioned, yes, someone has to keep the minutes, a corporate secretary, plus there are the costs involved. Sorry, but it will be more expensive because you need more people. And from this perspective, the supervisory board, well, yes, it's there somewhere, but I don't think it's a top priority.
Absolutely. And besides that, there's also a legal issue. If you create a supervisory board, to which legal entity from the list of those in the group of companies owned by this owner can it be attached? Because what we constantly encounter is that groups of companies owned by entrepreneurs are structured in such a way that it's actually impossible to create or implement a supervisory board right away without first optimizing the legal structure.
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, that's one of the obstacles. And what other obstacles might there be from your perspective when it comes to creating a supervisory board?
Right now, we're looking at the creation of the board from the owner's point of view. But what if we look at the creation of the board or the invitation to join the board from the perspective of a potential board member? Probably, if a company is, for example, aggressively optimizing taxes, it would be unacceptable for board members to join such a board and bear responsibility for what is happening.
In other words, anything that could pose reputational risks, and reputation is the main asset of independent board members, anything that could threaten their reputation will discourage people from joining the supervisory board of such a company.
So there are factors that make it impossible to immediately establish a supervisory board. And these factors may be related to certain views of the owner, such as a lack of trust in the instrument, in the board members, or an unwillingness to share authority with someone. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there may be structural issues within the company itself, for example, issues with the legal structure, and these need to be addressed. Until those issues are resolved, it is impossible to establish a supervisory board. There are also factors related to the willingness of potential board members to join such a board, especially if there are certain nuances involving taxation or other issues that could harm a board member's reputation.
But if we're talking about an advisory board, a classic advisory board, what can be done to make it more effective? And what are the prerequisites or triggers for this?
Yes, as we mentioned earlier. The main problem with an advisory board in an unsystematized company is that the advisory board gives advice, but no decisions are actually made. And the decisions that are made are not implemented. As a result, the effectiveness of such an advisory board is undermined by these problems. In order for the advisory board to be useful, first of all, the board needs to control the decision-making process, so that decisions are made at the right level. The owner must make decisions that depend on them and are appropriate for the owner's level, and top management at their own level, and after that, monitor the implementation.
So basically, the systematization of the company starts with the systematization of the board's work. In your experience, how quickly are owners ready to move from a classic advisory board where it's just advice and nothing more to a different form of cooperation?
Well, yes. In fact, when owners implement an advisory board, they also expect a certain level of effectiveness. And owners are among the first to notice when the advisory board is not working effectively. And they start to wonder, did we do something wrong? Let's make adjustments. Accordingly, when the owner sees the root of the problem precisely in the fact that decisions are not being made, advice is not being used, and decisions are not being implemented, he is quite easily ready to transfer the authority to control the adoption and implementation of decisions to someone else, for example, to the board.
It's interesting, if the decision is not implemented, yes, there can be two such ways. First, there is a problem with management and something needs to be done. Or the problem, what we are discussing now, is in the systematization of the board's work. And how do you distinguish one from the other?
There can be different factors behind this problem because sometimes the advice can be inadequate. The owner, top management, they don't see the point in making decisions based on inadequate advice, for example. This happens if the board was formed incorrectly, meaning the wrong people, the wrong expertise of these people, their area of expertise, and so on. On the other hand, it can be due to a lack of a culture of implementing decisions when top management is immature, unsystematic, and there is a certain managerial dysfunction, which we mention from time to time. But at this stage, it really is possible to sort this out. However, this problem cannot be a reason to change the top management. You can start by granting the board additional powers and see how that works.
As far as I remember, that was our first board meeting when this issue arose that decisions were not being implemented or issues kept recurring and so on. So please remind me, how did we come to this advisory board with additional powers?
All the more so because we understand that this situation, when the advisory board is ineffective, doesn't suit either the owner or the board members, since the owner is paying for a tool that isn't bringing any benefit to the company. On the other hand, for the board members, it's also not very interesting to constantly work, give advice, and watch as it's not implemented but simply ignored, and that's it. That's why the only way to regulate this is, I think it's about obtaining additional powers specifically to control the decision-making process and the implementation of those decisions. And given that there is a certain dissatisfaction among both the owners and the board members in such a situation, of course, the board and the owner can discuss this and decide what specific additional powers the board of a particular company needs.
Listen, can I say that this is an obligation, one of the board's obligations? If the board sees that in the format of an advisory board, classically, it doesn't work. Then you can either propose something or wait until the owner comes around. So in your opinion, how should it work?
I believe that, of course, it should come from the board because the owner is usually inside the system. That is, he is dependent. Accordingly, the board can analyze the situation more independently and make decisions regarding the reasons for such a situation. Yes, what caused it, what the reasons were, and how it can be corrected or adjusted in the future.
Sergiy, could you then remind us, for example, using one of the boards, the first board from one of the companies, how this originated and how it evolved into what we now call transitional boards?
Yes, this was the first board in which you and I participated. And it was precisely the board members and the owner who faced a situation where an advisory board in its pure academic form simply didn't work. We discussed this at the board level, exchanged thoughts with the owner, and decided to gradually transfer authority from the owner to the board. This, by the way, was the third or fourth meeting of the board, which took place once a month, that is, in 3 or 4 months. The board and the owner came to the conclusion that it was necessary to transfer additional powers to the board in order to increase the efficiency of the board's work.
Yes, and the first thing was the transfer of decision-making powers, right? That the board's decisions are mandatory for the top management to implement.
Yes, and in fact, this is a kind of organic picture, an organic development of the situation, right? Because we saw that additional powers were needed, which we documented with the owner, and he transferred them to the board. And then we decided that in order to be even more effective, we needed additional powers. And in the end, we came to the conclusion that it makes sense to have a list of powers, the full powers of the Supervisory Board, the Advisory Board, and our board, and to actually assemble the powers from this list in a way that satisfies both the owner and the board members and is effective for the current company. That's why, Dmytro, we came up with the name Transitional Board, because it takes on certain powers from the Supervisory Board. At the same time, in terms of form and format, it remains an advisory board.
Let's list the key powers that we have in that table, the ones that might be typical for a supervisory board or perhaps for an advisory board. Well, there's communication, of course, and giving advice to the owners or the CEO. That's the basic stuff, like strategizing. Participation in strategy development, adoption of the strategy and monitoring its implementation. What else is there?
Evaluation of top management. Of course, the advisory board shouldn't conduct a formal evaluation of top management, but the supervisory board should do it. And accordingly, the transitional board can request such authority from the owner to evaluate top management and provide the owner with their opinions regarding the qualifications and areas where top management needs development. Well, these are examples of additional powers that the owner can delegate to the board, to the advisory board. And these powers are typical, for example, for a supervisory board. They are not inherent to an advisory board, but for a transitional board, such powers can be delegated.
Yes, and listen, I think it's important to mention here that it's absolutely necessary to communicate these additional powers to the top management so they understand what powers this transitional board has.
Absolutely. That is, the owner can of course say that all decisions made by the board must be implemented, but it's preferable to have clarifications. Transitional boards are more systematized than advisory boards, and probably they take on some features that are characteristic specifically of supervisory boards.
Yes, that's really the case. Because, as was mentioned earlier, if you don't monitor the implementation for various reasons, because of timing, followed by one board meeting after another, then people start to forget what advice was given. So indeed, this is the beginning of systematizing the company. And the systematization of the board's work begins along with the introduction of documents such as, for example, an agenda. It shouldn't just be that we talked at a meeting and decided to look at certain issues, right? It will be structured, who reports, at what time, and so on. Well, usually if we're talking about this transitional board, it's the board chair who prepares it, and another document is the list of tasks that arise for various team members after the board meeting, right? What needs to be done, by when, and so on. And then at each meeting, monitor the completion of these tasks. And in the case of the transitional board, it's also the board chair who does this very, very effectively. He also prepares the agenda, and he prepares what we call the follow-up. Yes, this is a list of tasks, and this is the beginning of systematizing the company. So we've talked about the transitional board. I think we've outlined everything and shared our experience in our transitional boards. And now, to sum up, so in your opinion, what are the main pros and cons, the differences? The advisory board, the transitional board, and the supervisory board.
I believe that the pros and cons, well, in terms of effectiveness, really depend on the specific context and the particular company. Because again, if a company has a fairly high level of systematization, a supervisory board can exist alongside an advisory board. An advisory board can be assembled to focus on specific issues such as artificial intelligence or something else. But if we talk about boards in businesses that are just creating their first boards and then plan to either strengthen or transform them, of course, an advisory board for such companies will be ineffective because, as we mentioned earlier, decisions based on advice will not be made or executed as a rule. There may be exceptions, but generally that's the case. Or the board members may not want to join such a board because there are certain issues with the company's lack of transparency, and accordingly, something needs to be done at the top management level to create this transparency. Therefore, the only solution for companies that are not yet systematized but whose owner wants to move in that direction and wants to create a board that will help steer the company towards systematizing its strategy and building a systematic business is essentially an advisory board with additional powers. In other words, a transitional board, which is something you and I came up with.
Yes, I completely agree with that statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have just shared with you our approaches regarding the creation of an advisory board with additional powers, and we truly believe that this is the most effective tool for businesses that are establishing boards, especially since, at this stage, they are not yet sufficiently systematized. It is precisely the board that can help establish this systematization and assist both owners and top management.
By the way, we also talked about this in our part of the course at the Institute of Corporate Governance called Corporate Director, where we discuss the creation of boards in private companies. Please feel free to join us.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us on the Board of Directors channel with Sergiy Bulavin. See you in the next episodes.